A prisoner at Auschwitz cried out that he would never see his wife and children again. St. Maximilian Kolbe heard him, stepped out of formation and said, "I want to die in his place." The guards accepted. But what happened inside the starvation bunker over the next 2 weeks is the part almost no one tells. The men were given no food, no water, and one by one they began to die. But instead of screams coming from that cell, witnesses said they heard something Auschwitz was never meant to contain: prayer. And at the center of it was the same priest who had voluntarily walked toward death for a man he barely knew. Before we go back and discover what could make someone capable of such a sacrifice, write in the comments, "Saint Maximilian, intercede for my family." Because to understand what happened inside that bunker, we first need to understand the man who chose to enter it. He was 47 years old that morning, though nothing about him would have looked remarkable in a photograph. Less than 2 years earlier, he'd been running one of the largest religious publishing operations in the world. Now he wore a factory-made prisoner's uniform and answered to a number instead of a name. He was born Raymond Kolbe on January 8, 1894, in Zdunska Wola, a Polish town built around textile mills and the noise of looms running day and night. For over a century, Poland had not been a country at all. It had been carved into 3 pieces by the empires around it, and Polish children grew up learning that their language, their history, and their faith were things you protected in secret because the powers ruling over them wanted all 3 erased. A boy growing up in that world learned early that the things worth protecting were rarely the things you could protect out in the open. Raymond's parents, Julius and Maria, were weavers, devout and poor, raising 5 sons in a home where faith was not decoration, it was survival. According to accounts passed down within the family, Raymond was a difficult child in his early years, restless in a way that worried his mother. One day, exhausted, she asked him a question that was less a question than a plea. "What is going to become of you?" He later said, as an adult recalling that moment, that the question shook something loose in him. Not long after, he described an experience that he kept mostly to himself for years and only shared later in life. A vision of Mary offering him 2 crowns, one white and one red, purity and martyrdom, and asking which one he would accept. He said he answered that he would take both. This account comes from Kolbe's own later testimony, rather than an outside witness, and the Church has always treated it that way, as a deeply personal spiritual experience, not a verified historical event in the way we would verify a date or a document. Whatever happened in that room, something in the boy changed. At 13, he entered a Franciscan seminary along with an older brother, and there his teachers found someone unusual, sharp in mathematics and physics, capable enough that some of them privately wondered whether he had wandered into the wrong life entirely. A scientist mistaken for a monk. He would later earn doctorates in both philosophy and theology in Rome, a young Polish friar studying in a city that had nothing to do with the mills and the empire soldiers he had grown up under. There is a detail most versions of his story skip. Raymond once came close to leaving the Franciscan path altogether. Poland's fight to exist again as a nation was not an abstract idea to a teenager in that seminary. It was happening in the streets, in secret printing presses, in underground societies, in the dreams of a generation that had never once lived a single day in a free country. Raymond, like many young men his age, felt that pull directly, and for a time he seriously considered leaving the order to fight with a rifle instead of a rosary. He never fully explained in his own writing the exact moment that changed his course. What we know is that he stayed. He entered the novitiate in 1910 and took a new name there, Maximilian, professing his first vows to the order the following year and his final vows in 1914. And instead of a rifle, he picked up a weapon almost nobody in that seminary expected, a printing press, aimed not at an empire, but at despair itself. In 1917, while studying in Rome, Maximilian founded a movement he called the Militia of the Immaculata. Its purpose was simple to describe and staggering in scope: to win souls back to faith through devotion to Mary, one person, one family, one printed page at a time. He believed, with an intensity that made some of his own superiors uneasy, that the 20th century would be won or lost through mass communication. Radio was new, print was fast and cheap, and if the enemies of faith could use ink and paper to spread despair across an entire continent, Maximilian decided the Church could use those same tools to spread hope even faster. He was not interested in a small, quiet ministry tucked away in a chapel. He wanted every printing press he could get his hands on, and he wanted them running day and night. He returned to Poland with almost no money and a small hand press, and launched a Marian monthly with a first run of 5,000 copies. The early years were hard. Debts piled up, presses broke down. More than once it looked like the whole project might collapse before it reached a single new reader. Friars who had never run a business in their lives were suddenly managing subscriptions, deliveries, and printing schedules for an audience that kept growing faster than they could plan for. He kept going anyway, and the outsized effort turned into something outsized in return. Within a decade, the magazine reached over 1 million homes a month, printed and mailed by a community of friars who had built, almost entirely around it, one of the largest religious houses on earth. They called it Niepokalanow, City of the Immaculate. It grew to hold hundreds of friars, its own printing plant, even its own small radio station, a place built for one purpose, getting a message of hope into as many hands as possible before whatever was coming next could take it away. For a few years before 1939, it must have felt to the men living there like the war they had grown up fearing might never actually come again. Then came September 1939. German forces crossed into Poland, and the country Maximilian had spent his entire adult life dreaming of seeing free vanished again. This time under an occupation crueler than anything the old empires of his childhood had imposed. Niepokalanow was seized within weeks. Most of the friars were scattered or deported. Maximilian himself was arrested briefly, then unexpectedly released. What he did with that freedom tells you who he already was, long before he ever saw the gates of Auschwitz. He turned what remained of Niepokalanow into a shelter. Historical accounts describe the community sheltering thousands of refugees during the occupation, and among them, according to multiple accounts, a significant number of Jewish refugees fleeing persecution at a moment when hiding them carried an automatic death sentence if discovered by the occupying authorities. He kept publishing for as long as the occupation allowed it, printing material the Nazis considered dangerous simply because it kept hope alive in a broken country. Friars who had spent years learning to run printing presses were suddenly hiding families in attics and storerooms instead, feeding people who had nowhere else to turn, running a shelter under the nose of an occupying army that would have destroyed the entire community if it had found out. When the press finally became too much of a threat for the authorities to ignore, he was arrested a second time. This time there would be no release. In May 1941, he was loaded onto a transport bound for a camp whose name had already started to spread through Poland in whispers: Auschwitz. The arrival itself was designed to break a man before he even reached the barracks. Prisoners were stripped of their clothing, their names, their belongings, everything that had made them recognizable as individuals. Maximilian Kolbe stopped being Father Kolbe the moment he stepped off that transport and became a number instead. 16670, a number he would have to carry in his memory rather than on his skin, since the camp had not yet begun tattooing new arrivals, the only identity the camp would officially recognize from that point forward. Life inside the camp was designed to erase exactly the kind of man he had spent years becoming. Prisoners were reduced to numbers, to labor, to bodies to be worked and starved until they stopped being useful. Survivors who were held near him during those months described a pattern that had nothing to do with dramatic heroics, and everything to do with a habit so old it had become instinct. He gave away portions of his own starvation ration to men weaker than him. He took on extra labor to spare someone else a beating. According to testimonies gathered after the war, he heard confessions in secret, at the risk of execution, because in a place engineered to strip men of everything human, he kept treating the people around him as though they still had souls worth tending. None of that made the guards fond of him. If anything, it made him a target, a prisoner who refused to fully break in the way the system demanded. He was already thin before the transport to Auschwitz, and camp life left almost nothing of him beyond bone and will. But it meant that by the time the roll call of July 29 happened, the instinct that made him step out of formation was not new or sudden. It was the same instinct he had been quietly practicing for 2 months already, only now the price would be everything he had left instead of a piece of bread. That morning, a prisoner had vanished from the camp overnight. After the escape was discovered, Fritz ordered a brutal reprisal. 10 men from the block would be chosen to die by starvation, as a warning to everyone else that no single life mattered enough to risk defying the system. The deputy commandant, a man named Karl Fritz, walked the line of prisoners, pointing at random, and each man he pointed to understood immediately what it meant. There was no appeal, no chance to argue, nothing to do but watch him come closer down the row. When he reached prisoner 5659, Franciszek Gajowniczek, a Polish army sergeant who had survived the invasion 2 years earlier and had already been separated once from everything he knew, the sentence landed on a man whose mind went instantly, not to himself, but to the people he would never see again. Gajowniczek had a wife, Helena, and 2 sons, Bogdan and Juliusz. In the seconds after his number was called, What came out of him was not a plea for his own life. It was grief, raw and immediate for the family he was about to leave behind. There is a version of this story where nothing else happens. A man is chosen, he grieves, the guards move on to finish counting their 10, and history simply records 10 more names lost, inside a system built to erase names on an industrial scale. That is not what happened. From somewhere in the ranks, a prisoner broke formation, an act that alone could have gotten him shot on the spot, since prisoners did not move without permission inside Auschwitz under any circumstance. He walked directly toward Fritzsch, removed his cap in a gesture of respect that must have looked almost absurd in that setting, and spoke the words that have since been recorded, remembered, and repeated in the history of the church for more than 80 years. I am a Catholic priest. I would like to take his place because he has a wife and children. Fritzsch, apparently startled that any prisoner would dare address him unprompted, asked who he was. Kolbe answered again, simply, a Catholic priest. He offered nothing more, no explanation, no plea, no attempt to argue his own worth against Gajowniczek's. He did not need to. The trade was accepted. Gajowniczek was pushed back into the ranks of the living, standing there in stunned silence as another man walked forward to take the death that had, seconds earlier, belonged to him. Kolbe took his place among the 10 condemned, and the group was marched toward Block 13 into the underground bunker built specifically to kill slowly. The starvation bunker at Auschwitz was a windowless cell below ground level, damp concrete, no light, built for exactly one purpose. Men placed inside received no food and no water at all. It usually took the strongest among them 2 to 3 weeks to die, and every one of those days looked the same, cold, dark, and slower than the day before. The most detailed account of what happened inside that cell comes from Bruno Borgowiak, a Polish prisoner who worked as an orderly for the bunker and survived the war to testify about what he witnessed. According to his testimony, the 10 men inside did not behave the way the guards expected. In earlier cases, the days before death were marked by screaming, by desperate pounding on the door, by prisoners tearing at each other over the last scraps of moisture on the concrete floor. Instead, from Kolbe's group, there was singing. There was prayer. Borgowiak described hymns to Mary rising from underground, led by the same thin priest who had walked out of formation days earlier, and he said that even some of the guards, men who had grown numb to almost everything, found themselves unsettled by what they heard coming from that cell. One by one, the other 9 men in the bunker died. They were not names history remembers, ordinary prisoners caught in the same random selection that had almost taken Gajowniczek, men with their own wives, their own children, their own unfinished lives outside the wire. Kolbe, according to Borgowiak's account, spent what remained of his own strength comforting the ones who were still breathing and praying over the ones who had already gone still, holding on to something inside that concrete room that the entire machinery of the camp had been built to destroy. The conviction that a human being, even starving, even forgotten by everyone outside those walls, still mattered. By August 14, 1941, more than 2 weeks after he had stepped out of formation, only 4 of the original 10 men remained alive, and the camp needed the cell emptied for the next group awaiting the same sentence. According to the historical record surrounding his death, a camp physician entered the bunker and administered a lethal injection of carbolic acid directly into Kolbe's arm to finish what starvation had not yet completed. Witnesses reported that he lifted his arm to receive it without resistance. Maximilian Kolbe died that day. He was 47 years old. His body was taken to the crematorium, exactly like every other prisoner who died inside that camp. There was no grave, no headstone, nothing to mark the spot. For years, what remained of him existed only in the memory of the men who had been there and lived long enough to describe it to someone else. Borgowiak said something after the war that has been quoted many times since, though it survives to us through his own post-war testimony rather than a document written in the camp itself. In all his time working in that bunker, he said, he had never seen anything like it, a man who kept giving comfort until there was nothing physically left in him to give. Kolbe knew almost nothing about Gajowniczek. He knew only that a man was facing death and crying for his family, and for Kolbe, that was enough. It would be easy to tell this story as a story about bravery and stop there, but bravery alone does not fully explain what happened in that square. Countless brave men and women died inside Auschwitz without anyone ever learning their names, and their courage was no smaller than his. What set that moment apart was the shape of the choice itself. Kolbe did not die resisting an enemy, and he did not die trying to escape. He walked toward the very men who had the power to kill him and asked to be killed in someone else's place, for a reason the camp's entire logic could not process, and for a reward the camp's entire logic could not recognize. There was nothing in it for him inside that system. No strategic value, no chance of survival, nothing the guards could gain by allowing it. And yet they allowed it. Auschwitz ran on a specific kind of arithmetic. Every prisoner existed to be worked, to be used, to be discarded once used up. Kolbe's offer made no sense inside that arithmetic, and maybe that is exactly why Fritz accepted it. It cost the camp nothing to let one prisoner die instead of another. What the guards could not have known, standing in that square, was that they had just allowed something to happen that the entire machinery around them was built to prevent, an act of love the system could not absorb or explain away. That is not simply courage. In the Christian understanding, it is the oldest pattern there is. One life laid down so another might continue, love acting in exactly the place where the world expects only fear and self-preservation to act instead. It is the same pattern that stands at the center of everything the church believes. Only here it happened again, inside a place built to prove that pattern could never survive. When the church looked at how he died, it faced an unusual question. He had not been killed for refusing to deny his faith in a single dramatic moment, the way most martyrs are remembered. He had been killed for loving a man he barely knew more than he loved his own remaining years. In 1982, Pope John Paul II resolved that question by declaring him a martyr of charity, a title rarely used before him because his death did not need to fit the usual mold to stand as a real witness to Christ. Love, carried all the way to the end, was its own kind of martyrdom. Franciszek Gajowniczek survived the war. It cost him almost everything else. He was transferred to another camp before liberation finally came, and when he made it home to his wife Helena, he learned that their 2 sons had been killed in a bombing months before his release. The man Kolbe died for came home to find that death had already reached the very people that offer was meant to protect. What Gajowniczek did with the rest of his life was carry Kolbe's name everywhere he went. He was in Rome in October 1971 when Pope Paul VI beatified the priest who had taken his place, and again in Rome on October 10, 1982 when Pope John Paul II declared that same priest a saint. Each time he stood in a crowd of strangers, an old man in a foreign city, watching people who had never met either of them applaud a decision his own life had already made true decades earlier on a roll call square. Reporters who met him in those years often asked the same question. Why him? Why did he survive when so many did not? And he never pretended to have a satisfying answer. He died in 1995 at 93 and is buried at Niepokalanow, the community Kolbe had built decades before either of them had ever heard the word Auschwitz, a place that still stands today, still run by Franciscan friars, still receiving visitors who come to see where the story began. There is a kind of fear that does not need a camp or a war to arrive. It is the fear that shows up at night when the house has gone quiet and your mind goes straight to the people you love and to everything about their safety you cannot fully control. It does not announce itself with sirens or watchtowers. It just sits there in the dark, waiting for you to notice it. Gajowniczek knew that fear standing on a roll call square in front of armed men. Most of us know a quieter version of it in our own homes, thinking about a child asleep down the hall, a spouse driving home late, a parent whose health is starting to slip. I want to leave you something small for those nights. I put together a devotional guide called 30 Noches con María, 30 nights of prayer with the Holy Rosary, built around exactly this feeling. Fear for the people you love, worry that will not let you fall asleep, a desire to protect your family with a strength you do not always feel you have. It is not a formula, and it will not make every fear disappear on its own. It is a simple way to take your rosary each night, place what you are carrying into God's hands, and keep showing up in prayer for the people you love. You can find it in the first pinned comment. Let us pray. Lord, you took one man's fear on a roll call square, and out of it you drew a love strong enough to give away an entire life. We bring you our own fear tonight, the fear we carry quietly for the people we love, the fear that keeps us awake long after the rest of the house has gone silent. Saint Maximilian Kolbe, you stood where death was already certain and chose to stand there for someone else instead of yourself. For every parent afraid for a child, for every husband or wife afraid for the other, for every family carrying a fear too heavy to say out loud at the dinner table, intercede. Teach us that love can walk directly toward what frightens us most and not be destroyed by it. Mary, Immaculate Mother, to whom Kolbe gave everything he built, watch over the people we cannot stop worrying about tonight. Hold what we cannot hold ourselves. Amen. A man walked out of a line inside Auschwitz because a stranger's family mattered more to him than the years he had left. Whatever fear has been keeping you up at night, it is not too small to bring to God, and it is not too large for him to carry. Share this story with someone who needs to remember tonight that love can still overcome fear.